It's the 2nd of March, 1996, 30 years ago this week. Hawke-Keating takes the stage in front of hundreds of true believers at the Bankstown Leagues Club.
I've always passionately believed that all power came from the public, every last morsel of it, and it's the nation's perfect right to decide who they want to govern it. I take this opportunity to congratulate John Howard. I wish him and his government well.
Keating's government had just been ousted in a landslide, a trouncing after 13 years of Labor in power. It was much a moment of reflection as it was one of concession.
We've opened the country up. We've opened the country up and turned it towards the world as never before. And we've done it in a way which has also put a high premium on social equity and social consensus. And we've also taken the bigger view and tried to do something about some of the intractable problems, like a proper basis of reconciliation with our Indigenes, which we held to be important.
The door on the Hawke-Keating years was coming to a close, and another was about to open on a new political era. One that would change the country and one that is still impacting the way politics is run today. All shaped by one man.
Can I say to you, and my first words are addressed to all of the people of Australia, that I am very conscious of the enormous responsibility that has been placed upon me and upon my colleagues by the verdict of the Australian people today.
I'm Daniel James, and you're listening to 7am. The course Howard set for the country during his 11 years in the nation's highest office would redefine the Liberal Party, reshape the economy, harden the culture wars, and transform the way power is exercised in Canberra. In this 3-part series, author Amy Remeikis, who just released a book on John Howard, takes us back to his years in power. From his improbable rise to the prime ministership, in which he resurrected a political career many had written off, to the way he consolidated power and reshaped the nation in his own image. This is The Howard Effect, a series by 7am. Episode 1, Australia's sliding doors moment.
And I want to say that the government that I will lead will be a government not only for the people who voted for us, but also for the people who voted against us.
Amy, tell me about the seismic shift that was about to occur on the night of March 2nd, 1996, as power transitioned from Paul Keating to John Howard.
Yeah, it's a moment in history I don't think we think about enough, because it essentially set up Australia from the direction that it was heading in terms of opening itself up more to the world, reconciling itself with its Indigenous history, shifting away from the Anglosphere into the more geographical position of the Asia Pacific. And all of a sudden, John Howard is elected, not because his policies necessarily spoke to Australians, but because he was not Paul Keating.
I want to thank Paul Keating for his gracious words.
And that is something to remember in talking about all of this. It's that Paul Keating had become so unpopular, mostly because of the early 1990s recession.
Paul, I thought these damn fool things were supposed to go up. We keep filling the thing with hot air.
Don't get your glands in a knot, Bob. It'll be a soft landing.
But also because he was forcing Australia to accept some really uncomfortable truths. And there's this idea now that perhaps he was moving too quickly to try and push Australia into the future. And so then comes along John Howard, who tells Australia that if you are feeling uncomfortable with the direction that Labor and Paul Keating in particular are taking you in, vote for me. I'm an average bloke who wants average bloke things, and I will make sure that you are famously relaxed and comfortable.
Amy, comfortable and relaxed became a defining catchphrase of Howard's campaign, a country at ease with its history, present and future. In his mind, what did he consider uncomfortable about Australia?
It's a really interesting question because you have to go back 30 years to what was happening in Australia. And if you look at the 94 and 95 cabinet papers, so the last couple of years of the Keating government, these talking about wanting Australia to become a republic, which is shifting Australia away from the motherland of England and the Anglosphere, about wanting to build a cultural identity for Australia beyond sport. Hawke-Keating was saying, hey, I think we've matured enough as a country that we can start actually being a middle power and start having more cultural impact in the world, which meant, of course, also reconciling with Australia's atrocious Indigenous history. And while you can't say that we were definitely on the steps to reconciliation, you could say that it was the beginning of the reconciliation process under Keating.
It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Hawke-Keating, to officially...
He had done the famous Redfern speech.
It begins, I think, with an act of recognition. Recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases and the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers.
He had spoken about the inequality between Indigenous Australia and white Australia and how we needed to start closing that gap.
We cannot imagine that we'll fail. And with the spirit that is here today, I'm confident that we won't fail. I'm confident we will succeed in this decade. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Around the same time, we had things like Mabo.
At the heart of today's ruling, a 10-year battle by the Merian people of the Murray Islands in the Torres Strait for recognition of their traditional rights to the island. By recognising the islanders' native title, the court has acknowledged the land belonged to the Indigenous people before white settlement.
And so all of this was happening at a time when Australians, white Australians, previous Labor voters, working class voters, were feeling very uncomfortable about the cultural shifts, but also quite uncomfortable about their own individual wealth because of the recession that we had just gone through. And John Howard, in an electoral preview that he did with Liz Jackson, a journalist with Four Corners at the time, was asked what his vision was for Australia.
Can you give us a John Howard vision for the year 2000 to the Australian public, such that they will see, yes, this is the person we would like to be Prime Minister?
Let me respond to your question.
And almost by accident, he later said,
I would like to see them comfortable and relaxed about their history. I'd like to see them comfortable and relaxed about the present. And I'd also like to see them comfortable and relaxed about the future.
And that really ended up resonating with a lot of voters.
The pace of reform during the Hawke-Keating years transformed the economy, floating the dollar, cutting tariffs, opening Australia to the world. But for John Howard, that breakneck change came at a cost. Both men grew up in suburban Sydney during the Menzies years. They saw the same Australia, but they drew very different lessons from it. For Keating, the 1950s were a warning, a country protected, complacent and falling behind. As he told Parliament in no uncertain terms in 1992.
And then, of course, we had then a flurry of comment by the member for Bennelong about the 50s, what a very good period it was. A very, very good period, he said. A golden age. This is the golden age. This is the golden age when vast numbers of Australians never got a look in. That the women who didn't get a look in had no equal rights and no equal pay. Where migrants were factory fodder. Where Aborigines were excluded from the system. Where we had these xenophobes running around about Britain and bootstraps. And that awful cultural cringe under Menzies which held us back for nearly a generation. That awful cultural...
But for the member for Bennelong, John Howard, the 50s were a utopia, a place he wanted the country to get back to. Menzies was his hero.
and even with him being a big fan of Menziesism, it was cherry picking what parts of Menzies Australia that he wanted and what parts of that, 1950s white Australia he wanted. And you really have to go back to how John Howard grew up. He grew up in a white, Methodist, conservative suburb of Earlwood in Sydney. It was not a multicultural suburb. And you could see that in his, some of his first policy documents that he created. Famously, there's one that he released in 1988 called One Australia. And if you read it now, it's almost like a primer for not only the Australia that Howard built over his 11 years in office, but also for One Nation's policies. And back then it was Asian migration, and he ended up losing the Liberal leadership after cautioning against more Asian migration.
There is some concern about the pace of change involved in the present level of Asian migration, and I think any government is entitled to take that into account.
And Australia, and more importantly, the Liberal Party at that point, were not so comfortable being so openly racist. This was still an Australia that was reckoning with the White Australia policy. But then you get to the mid-90s, and as he said, the times will suit me, and they did. And all it took was the economic insecurity of the early 90s to create the sort of environment where someone like Howard would flourish.
Coming up, from punchline to political powerhouse, the Howard comeback. In 1985, John Howard became Liberal leader after a party room showdown called by Andrew Peacock.
It is certainly, in a personal sense, a very significant day and very important day in my own parliamentary career. I accept the leadership of the Liberal Party with a sense of great responsibility, profound gratitude that my colleagues have reposed that confidence in me.
After the public rejected his platform at the 1987 election, he was booted as leader by the party in 1989 and said this about the chances of a return to leadership.
The prospect of mounting some return leadership bid of his own, he dismisses with scorn as Lazarus with a triple bypass.
It's hard to imagine that at one stage, he was almost seen as a laughingstock of Australian politics. So it was a remarkable comeback and ascent to power.
It is completely remarkable in modern terms. You almost cannot imagine that we will ever see somebody who lost as much as Howard did come and take over the leadership of the party, given a second or third chance, and then manage to hold that party, almost completely by himself in the direction that he wanted. But not necessarily because Australia suddenly became more conservative, although there certainly was elements of that which follows all times of economic insecurity. And I think we can even say that we're seeing that play out now. Howard knew how to seize on that, but he also spent most of his political career up until the mid-90s laying the foundations for the times that he wanted. Looking back, you can see that Howard had three main priorities that he wanted to address almost immediately. One was his lifelong battle against industrial relations. He really wanted to nobble union power. He could not stand unions. And one of the first things that he did was essentially set up the waterfront dispute as a way to break the unions.
It was a human barricade several hundred deep across the road, frustrating the passage of trucks into the Port Botany terminal.
On April the 7th, 1,400 plus workers were summarily and illegally dismissed from their jobs in the middle of the night with armed guards, with dogs on chains.
The MUA will be once again responsible for damaging businesses and losing people jobs.
And he convinced Australians that the waterfront dispute was about greedy unions who were trying to take advantage of Australians, when what he was doing was handing over worker power to corporations and to their bosses.
In Cairns, the Prime Minister defended his actions, saying an efficient waterfront was vital to the country's future.
Unless we create the economic weapons and tools for Australians to compete effectively with the rest of the world, we're not going to survive.
The other things that he wanted to do were slow down any steps towards Indigenous reconciliation, stop the Republic, and stop any slide away from Australia's identity within the Anglosphere. And he started that almost immediately.
Australians of this generation should not be required to accept guilt and blame for past actions and policies over which they had no control.
And the other thing that he wanted to do was reform the tax system. So he was an economic conservative. So he set about reforming the beginnings of Australia's tax system. And we still see that today with baked-in middle-class welfare, a housing market that's out of control.
Amy, slow down. You're taking us into episode 2 at a rate of knots. We're just not ready for that yet.
All of those things we can trace back to Howard.
No matter where you stand on Howard's politics, there is little doubt that in purely political terms, he was the most gifted politician of his time, a mixture of rigid ideologue and fleet-footed pragmatist.
He was really slick, but not obviously so. So, the year before he was elected in 1995, he was saying about what Keating was doing at the time, no one owns the national identity.
Let me say, Mr. Speaker, that the interests of 18.5 million Australians are more important than the identity of one.
That was basically him saying somebody telling us what the national identity is not correct because we know instinctively what the national identity was.
And if we do want to achieve change that unifies and doesn't divide, then we need to choose a method of facilitating that change that the entire Australian community can feel comfortable about.
And we are still having the arguments around Australia's national identity that were put in place when average Joe John Howard came along and said, actually, I just think that it's Anzac Day and Australia Day and that nobody is better than anybody else, which we all know is a dog whistle. But he was so effective at it that nobody could really get a handle on how to counter him at the time.
You argue Howard didn't invent the culture wars, but he did master them. What did he understand about identity politics that others didn't?
He understood about identity politics that it truly was emotional, that it was not rational, it was not something intelligent, it's not something that you necessarily could teach people. It was about weaponizing feelings. Howard just absolutely mastered being average.
So if you chose 3 words, they'd be?
I'd like to be seen as an average Australian bloke.
So most people saw him as being quite benign, bumbling.
As a person, I think somebody very much with quintessential Australian values.
But that was a very cultivated political costume that he was wearing. He knew exactly who he was speaking to.
And
I can't think of a nobler description of anybody than to be called an average Australian bloke.
He was speaking to Australians who felt they had been left behind. Howard's sell was going, I'm not actually selling you anything. I'm just pointing out that you are right to feel discomforted by all of this. And while he was doing that, while he was started waging a lot of these culture wars, at the same time, he was winding back union power. He was winding back government regulations. He was winding back government support and all of these other things that people had relied on for community, for organising, for being able to, actually get ahead. He presented all of this to the Australian people in a way where they felt he was speaking for them, even when what he was doing was essentially setting them up for failure. What he did was set us up for generations of inequality, division, and put us backwards, not only on the world stage, but also domestically.
The other politically seismic event of 1996 was Pauline Hanson's maiden speech to Parliament.
I and most Australians want our immigration policy radically reviewed and that of multiculturalism abolished. I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Between 1984 and 19...
Did Howard see the speech and the reaction to it as a threat or an opportunity?
Oh, it was absolutely an opportunity. And he had learnt from 1988, where he had gone out on a limb when it came to Asian migration, how far he could go as somebody who was in the mainstream and how he would be held to account for what he said. So he did not criticise Pauline Hanson.
People do feel able to speak a little more freely and a little more openly about what they feel. In a sense, the pall of censorship on certain issues has been lifted.
It wasn't until the lead up to the 1998 Queensland state election where Pauline Hanson was starting to become a force in Queensland and threatening to take LNP seats that Howard started playing things a little bit tougher.
The Prime Minister has made his strongest attack yet on independent MP Pauline Hanson's anti-Asian stand.
She is wrong when she says that Australia is in danger of being swamped by Asians. She is wrong to seek scapegoats for society's problems.
And it wasn't a moral stance that he took, but he did do a decree for political reasons that she was to be put last. But then we also have to remember that when she came back into the Senate in 2016, it was John Howard who gave the Liberals and the Nationals the approval to be able to work with her, effectively lifting the ban of putting her last by saying that you have to work with her. Now, of course, 10 years on, we know that that has cannibalised the Liberal and the National Party, that One Nation is once again rising in the polls, and that so far they're doing it at the expense of the Liberals Nationals. And ironically, from a polling position, if they did do the put her last, it actually would probably stymie enough of her vote at an election booth where they wouldn't be as panicked about losing as many seats. So you could say that John Howard set the Liberals and Nationals on the path that we see today for election annihilation.
Amy, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Next time on The Howard Effect.
When you think about the Howard government, you think of strong economic management.
There is no doubt, my fellow Australians, that this country desperately needs a new taxation system.
Not the circumstances of high iron ore prices, a mining boom, and increased tax receipts all coming in at the same time to basically give him a giant treasure load of revenue.
I haven't found anybody in 7.5 years shake their fist at me and say, Howard, I'm angry with you for letting the value of my house increase.
Buoyed by the mining boom, Howard funded sweeping tax cuts and rewired the tax system, so higher earners received larger breaks than those on lower incomes.
It was Howard readdressing the tax system to put more onus and responsibility on individual taxpayers rather than richer people and corporates who actually could afford to be paying more tax to pay for the services that we all need and use.
That's tomorrow. See you then.